Hello, my name is Artie Davis and I welcome you to the Business Accelerator 2022. The Business Accelerator is launched by Civi and done in partnership with the Government of the Netherlands and Meta. We're excited to present this episode should every company have a corporate water policy and have experts joining us from all over the world to share their experiences. On our panel today, we have Amanda Gardner, Head Sustainability, Innovation and Engagement, Meta; Kate Lamb, Global Director, Water Security, CDP; Tom Williams, Director for Nature, World Business Council for Sustainable Development; and Will Sarney, Founder and CEO at Water Foundry US. Thank you guys so much for being here and joining us for what we hope will be a great panel discussion with all of you sharing experiences and case studies, and of course, with the audience telling us how we move forward. My first question is to all of you, and I'll ask you one by one, but to give you the question format, as we discussed a little bit before, it's a situation where the question is kind of asked and answered as far as the four panelists are concerned. Should we have a corporate water policy? Yes. So that's not what we'll focus on today, but it's how. And how do we create engagement and sustainability when it comes to stakeholders in this discussion? So I want to ask each of you to unpack the why on corporate water sustainability and say, what are the impacts when it comes to climate, resilience, equity, on corporate water policy, and why should we have this? I want to start with you, Kate, actually.
Thanks, Arati, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. Obviously, my perspective on this is that all companies should have a policy. Ideally, it's business policy and its business plan, fully integrated with the issues and aligned with the outcomes of a water secure future. Water security, or water insecurity in this case, as we know, poses a real and present threat to almost every business model on the planet currently. We are far behind the goals of achieving SDG 6, and as a result, many businesses find themselves on the front line of this crisis, whether that is the $15.5 billion of stranded assets that we've already seen happen as a result of worsening water security, or the $530 trillion worth of assets that are likely to be stranded in the future as a result of continuing worsening water security. This is clearly not something that can be kicked into the long grass and dealt with by the traditional water management. This is something that should be strategically addressed by the board. And at CDP, we work to develop mechanisms that incentivize and showcase how companies ultimately can grow differently, and so that they can achieve the outcomes that we're seeking from a water secure future, whilst also maintaining their viability into the future.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you so much. I'm going to come to you, Will, to get your perspective on the question.
So the short answer is yes. I would reframe the question, of course, being a good consultant, and respond by saying that every company should have a corporate water strategy, and as opposed to a policy. And what I mean by strategy very much aligns with Kate's view, which is it really has to create business value. And if it doesn't create business value, then it's going to be an overhead function. It's really not going to deliver impact, drive the ability for a company to create brand value and fuel their business growth in the face of some fundamental challenges that the water sector faces that are amplified by the impacts of climate change. So thinking about it, it's really, how does a water strategy drive business strategy and add value? And I want to reframe this just a little bit and unpack it to your request. For me, it's more than footprinting. It's more than just reducing how much water you're using or how much water you're reusing. It's really thinking about a company's handprint. And I'll use Meta as an example. I mean, think about the power of Meta as a company to really positively influence consumer behavior, increase education awareness around the issues associated with water through their social media platform. That is much more powerful, in my opinion, than chasing liters or chasing gallons to just achieve some water footprint goals. So I believe the private sector has enormous potential, but also let's not put a burden on the private sector to deliver results that should be firmly in the hands of the public sector. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. We'd just like to expand it a little bit in terms of how we define what a strategy looks like.
I think you make a great point, and also using the word strategy allows for a dynamic nature of updating information, and that's something that will be really critical to our discussion right now, and it allows for kind of the nuance that water really has compared to, and you said it well, climate, which we come to a little bit later. Tom, I'd love to get your input.
Great, thanks, Artie. And look, I concur. It's a yes from me as well. And it's necessary because it sets the course for corporate action. The right governance, the right lines of accountability, the right targets you should be setting. And if you think of climate, nature, and equity, also enables you to look at the synergies and the potential trade-offs between those targets as well. And it's all about the strategy, as Will said, that enables you to actually meet those targets. And it also creates the environment to work with other stakeholders, whether that's in your supply chain, whether it's with your peers, whether it's with governments, for example. And on this last point, it's important to have transparency with your water policy so companies can be held to account. But then it also invites some open innovation as well. So if you have a transparent water policy, it actually invites your suppliers, invites your peers to collaborate. And that's what we do at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's all about pre-competitive collaboration, and there's lots of space for it to happen in water. And I think it starts with corporates having a very clear, transparent and accountable water policy in place.
Amanda, I've left you to last because, of course, you've heard what everyone has to say of what they think industry needs and is using to incentivize change. And you sit on the seat of industry on our panel today. So it'd be great to hear from you on the question on corporate water policy. I know.
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
And you won't be surprised to hear me say yes as well. I think every company needs to at least understand the impacts of water on its business and conversely, the impacts of its business on water. And for companies, especially for whom water is a significant issue, for example, because they use significant amounts of water in the development of their products or in running their operations, I think it's incredibly important to number one, commit to respecting human rights, including the right to water, which are set out in the guiding principles on business and human rights. And then I think number two, set out a clear public policy, strategy, commitment to managing water effectively and replenishing water where it makes sense. I think that includes establishing a strategy and targets for achieving that, which can serve as kind of the roadmap for action. But just to reiterate the last point there that Tom was making, reporting regularly on that progress against those targets and against that strategy is also incredibly important. For us at Meta, we use water in our offices and our buildings, but most importantly, we use water to cool our data centers. And if you aren't aware, data centers are what power the internet. They power our apps, our services, things like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, et cetera. And because of their significance for our business, they're also the source of our most material environmental impacts. And so we make it a real priority to evaluate those impacts regularly and to manage those risks accordingly.
And Amanda, that's really...
We do have a water positive goal, and I'll speak to that
exactly.
a bit later.
No, I want to give you a follow-up question actually on exactly that, because what you're saying right now is, of course, the ambition and the intention of industry to step forward and take a leadership role, but also why it makes sense within your operations. Yeah. And as you were just saying, that Meta has taken a position to be water positive by 2030. Yeah. And I'd like to tie in that ambition to what Kate was saying about business strategy and the bottom line. It would be great to hear from you on how this strategy has a bottom line perspective to it and what industry can learn from that.
Sure. So our water stewardship strategy it consists of essentially two parts. So number one is maximizing the efficiency of our operations. And number two is then supporting high quality projects that restore local watersheds near our data centers. In terms of the operational side of that, our data centers are already among the most efficient in the world. That's not to say we don't use any water, because we do, but we have designed our data centers to be on average 80% more water efficient than the industry standard, and we're always looking for opportunities to improve. So for example, we use what's called evaporative cooling, essentially humidity, to cool our data centers. And a couple of years ago, we launched a pilot to lower the relative humidity at each of our centers by about 7% in order to better conserve water. And by doing that, we found we can reduce our total water use. And so now we're implementing this across all 14 of our data centers and incorporating it into design standards. Why? And that goes back to your question. I mean, it makes good business sense. If we're using less water, we're paying for less water. So that's a big reason. If we look at the restoration part of our stewardship plan, look, last year we set our goal to be water positive, which ultimately means we want to restore more water than we use by 2030. And in some areas where we operate, places are more water insecure than in others. So we really optimize for the areas where water is most scarce or insecure. So for example, we'll do more restoration activities at data centers in dry, arid regions, parts of the US, in the West, for example. And our target is to restore 200% of the water we consume in those highest water stress areas and 100% of the water we consume in medium water stress areas. And we do that by partnering with local nonprofits to identify projects. And those projects always have a connection to the source water we consume. So why does this make sense? I think, again, if we use less water, we pay for less water. But also, we have a long-standing public commitment to sustainability. And by maintaining that commitment and delivering on it, it helps us to manage our operational and reputational risks. So we need water to cool our data centers. If water isn't there, our data centers won't work. So there's a real business need, and it's also about license to operate. So if we were perceived to be harming instead of contributing to the communities we operate in, that would lead to significant disruption for us. We found that once we explain our water commitments and outline to communities how we're going to improve water resilience in the areas we're operating, many communities become champions for our data centers.
And that's amazing. It's the win-win scenarios of bringing both business and, of course, social and environmental sustainability together. And it's becoming easier and easier to make that case now because you can see, like you say, especially water-scarce areas, of course, it then makes sense to start coming in and seeing strategies. And you touched upon innovation and technology. I want to come back to that later on how you can actually leverage that to create these solutions on the ground. But of course, now Meta is a huge multinational and has the muscle to do this and also has potentially the understanding of how to work with the fluidity of the information coming in, the number of metrics coming in at you to decide how do you get rid of the noise. And CDP becomes an enabler to maybe get rid of that noise and to be kind of an ally to business development, but also keep the information up to date. And that's really interesting, Kate, because CDP has grown so much in the last 20 years, from the number of companies you had disclosing maybe 15 years ago to where you are today. And that has been as a result of two things, I think. One is the trust building that you have with the companies that you work with, but also a way in which you translate information as it grows every day. The number of metrics you're dealing with from 15 years ago today, of course, changed as well. How do you handle that friction to science-based targets, evolution of our knowledge, and industry that would like consistent, comparable reporting that is predictable?
It's a really good question, Arathi, and I'm glad you asked it because not many people do quite appreciate the complexity or the tightrope that, in a sense, we have to walk at CDP. Just to give some context for our audience here, when we started the program for water disclosure, we had around 150 companies disclosing. Today, we've got over 4,000 responding just 10 years later. And that data not only is shared and made publicly available and shared with a range of academics and NGOs and the likes and other governments, but it's fundamentally put back into the market, right? So we have deals with the likes of Bloomberg and MSCI and other organizations such as those raters to ensure that our data gets in the hands of over 670 financial institutions controlling around $130 trillion worth of assets. And so it's a real, that the service, in a sense, an efficient service. For example, we're preventing Meta from getting 670 requests for a variety of different water-related indicators by giving them one single questionnaire to fill in every year. And of course, consistency and comparability between that data is vital for certain stakeholders. And so we maintain a level of consistency. Some of the questions that, for example, I designed with Will 10 years ago are still in the questionnaire in maybe slightly different form, but they're still there. Are you exposed to water-related risks? Do you undertake a robust risk assessment? Do you have a target? And tell us about the progress that you're making against those. But as you said, science is particularly telling us that we are far from on track with achieving our results, and that we need to move and push the market faster and beyond where they would otherwise be on the issue. We've established a range of business norms already, setting a broader variety of targets as an example, but that is not enough. And we know that we need more from businesses ultimately to achieve our outcomes. And so we review the questionnaire every year, and we implement a series of small interventions every year, but we save our big ticket items, a big shift in direction for every 3 years. And we undergo a period of public consultation and engagement with a range of NGOs to advise on those changes and make sure that they are fit for purpose and aligned with latest thinking. As an example, we're currently working on a series of what we're calling forward-looking indicators. So to speak to the point around business strategy, no longer is it sufficient for a company to disclose what its water consumption is today or what it was like last year and how it's changed. But more fundamentally, it's vital that we and the world and investors understand what future consumption looks like and how confident the company is in actually ensuring that they're going to be able to consume that volume of water in the places that they need it. There's a whole series of such indicators currently under development, and we believe they have the potential not only to deliver really useful indicators back out to the market on forward projections for businesses, but ultimately ensure that the future projections or future plans of those businesses are aligned with our outcomes. It gives us much more meaningful indicators about where the companies are going and how serious they are about getting there. But it is a balance that we strike. Our role ultimately is as one of a critical friend to the businesses that are engaging. We do ask the challenging questions, but in a way that will enable them to understand why we're doing so and bring them along so that they are ultimately fit for the future and part of the solution that we need.
And that's great because you create the incentive, the framework, and also kind of give them an asset and understanding of how to actually make this possible by disclosing. But then I'm going to ask the question to Tom to say, okay, so we have this information, we have the how, and we have the list of how companies can actually engage, but that has to then be internalized, institutionalized, and understood by the companies as to the business worthiness of understanding, taking this action, taking this next step, to say, okay, we will disclose the CDP, for example. And that is another challenge in terms of the business conversation to say, we need to institutionalize change, we need to understand how the metrics actually apply. And then we need to then deploy. So it'd be great to hear from you, Tom, about how these different metrics can translate into actually business and leadership making the changes required.
Yeah, thanks, Artie. And one of the important aspects here when we talk about data and metrics is around standardization and harmonization, because that really helps you get to scale. Without standardization, you have thousands of business scrambling for data that may or may not be helpful for decision making, and may or might not be the same data being used downstream by another water user. If you look at financial accounting, they sought standardization nearly a century ago so that all companies use the same principles and practices in collecting and reporting on financial data. So we need the same for non-financial data. And of course, water-related data is more complex than financial data in that it has local dimensions, so it needs to be sufficiently granular. There's also variations in water-related data depending on meteorological or climate conditions. And with these complexities or nuances around water-related data, we need to have a consistent understanding of how it can be used for different purposes. And this is where the frameworks are important. And some of the important frameworks where data is required include things like TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. And these frameworks provide guidance on climate and nature-related risk and disclosures, and also science-based targets for nature, which for fresh water will determine thresholds for water use. And the challenge is that because water is a transversal issue across climate and nature, there can be a tendency in applying these frameworks that water is addressed in a piecemeal way. So what we need alongside this standardization of data is harmonization of frameworks to ensure that they are compatible. And there's a lot of work ongoing in this space around standardization and harmonization. For example, the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, they are developing a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability related disclosure standards. And the frameworks I mentioned earlier, TCFD, TNFD, and SBTN, they're all working together to align their approaches. So we're starting to see...
I'm just going to ask you a question while you're saying that, Tom. Just in terms of the frameworks that are being developed and what you said is in place and is being kind of discussed right now, I want to ask all of you actually, and please come in as you feel fit, but I want to ask, is there anything we can learn from climate on this in exactly this way in terms of getting the standardization and the optics coming together to say it is complex, but how do we actually now take these different acronyms and these different organizations to take the next step? Tom, I'm going to ask. Oh, Will's there. Okay, Will, go for it.
I would just sort of hit the pause button a little bit before we start framing water as a, something we can model after climate. And, where we're headed right now is, everyone's talking about net zero for water. Well, to Tom's point, water is incredibly complex. It has, economic, environmental, social, and spiritual dimensions. And we often forget about the spiritual part. So I think there's certainly lessons to be learned from what has been going on with climate in terms of traction. But we need to make sure that we don't dumb down the water complexity to a point where we're just chasing simple metrics. So it's just a little bit of a pushback, and you were encouraged a little bit of friction. So I thought I would jump in with something.
I think I want to pick up on the dumb down, because that is the challenge, right? Like how do you balance what industry needs to move forward, and how do you not overwhelm the discussion? And you have these two different conversations that have so much to them. How do you find the middle ground?
So I'm gonna suggest. And sorry, Will, I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't think they are two different conversations at all. I think that, the conversation about disclosures and harmonization of disclosures has never just been about climate. It's been about what we now call ESG, or corporate responsibility, or corporate sustainability, and looking at the spectrum of issues that relate to corporate responsibility and how companies behave in the world. And we are starting, or the world is starting, by looking at climate disclosures. But the idea has always been to broaden to the realm of other environmental, social, and governance topics. And I think that's not, that doesn't mean taking a cookie cutter approach to every topic, but it does mean starting with one, testing to see how it works, and then integrating the others. And they are all related. It's not a one-by-one approach. So I just wanted to step in and say that.
I think that's great, because I'm going to actually ask Kate to comment on that, because of course you're working in this space right now and actually developing these metrics and frameworks. So it'd be great to get your perspective on not being a cookie cutter, but actually trying to bring it together into one.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we are at the center of this storm, right? We are one of the alphabet soup, as we're known as, and one of the frameworks that are no doubt muddying the water in some respects, but in essence, CDP invented climate and environmental disclosure, right? And before we existed, this concept didn't exist in the world. And as a result, our contribution into this space is to assist these new and emerging frameworks to learn from what we've done in the past and to inform. So we're a knowledge partner for the TNFD. It would be surprising to hear. We were a very strategic partner with the development of the TCFD, and CDP has now taken the TCFD framework, which essentially is a piece of paper that sits on a website, into our disclosure mechanism, so that every time a company discloses climate related data, it is disclosing against the TCFD. We have operationalized the TCFD. We have ambitions to do the same thing for the TNFD, and so having a seat at the table to ensure that we're informing it, guiding it, and ensuring that the complexity of these issues are reflected in the indicators that emerge is ultimately the role that we're having. I'm also the co-chair of the SBTN Council, and lead the water development for the Freshwater Hub. And so being at this sort of center of the storm allows us to leverage our expertise in a way that presents a pragmatic way through, right? The world is a complex place. ESG can be messy. But if you consider the volume of financial related data that companies are disclosing every year relative to the volume of environmental data that they're disclosing every year, it is vastly different worlds. Look at the team that Meta will have established for disclosing financial data. It is huge. It's got a massive budget. It's got the best IT systems in the world to ensure that it is getting the data that it needs at its fingertips. If you look at the same setup and the similar budget, similar team for ESG or environmental reporting, typically, and Meta may be different and maybe the outlier, but what we typically find is that those teams responsible for reporting environmental data are typically those teams that are also expected to build the budget, build a business case, implement the projects, and that is the difference, I think.
Could I jump in for a minute?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Kate, you bring up a really important point, and Tom, I'm going to dust off a quote that accountants will save the world. So the minute sustainability, strategy, performance, and reporting is integrated into a business strategy, then you get the resources to deliver, and then you get audited, integrated reporting, and that's how you have a broader impact. Not when ESG reporting is viewed as an overhead function and understaffed and undercapitalized. So. I don't know. I agree with you that it needs to be treated in an integrated way with financial reporting, because it is arguably as important, if not more important, in the world right now.
And I actually want to pick up on that point, Will, and actually come to Tom, because that's something we spoke about, is that how do you get this to kind of trickle down at management, shareholder, board level to actually say this is actually central? It can't be put to one side. And the conversation we had is that it's actually becoming so. Industry is understanding the value by virtue of the bottom line kind of metrics that come with it. What have you been seeing from WCSD?
I think one of the, sort of going back also to the question around what can we learn from the climate space, and to respond to this question as well, there's a part of it which is about language. We can overcomplicate matters by creating new language to explain similar or the same things. A classic example you could say from climate is when you talk about Scope 3 emissions, and many companies are getting to grips with their Scope 3 emissions, understanding what it is, what it means, how they can actually measure them. And from a nature and biodiversity perspective, we'll come up with some new wording to describe exactly the same thing, which puts you back at step zero with getting some internal buy-in at companies. So I think there's a lot we can learn about simplifying the language to make sure that there's some level of coherency across all these different ESG topics. And I think that will go a long way to bringing your CFO on board, for example. They have limited bandwidth to understand some of these new material issues. So if you can translate it into language they fully understand and apply, that's going to take you a long way.
I think that's excellent. We're actually running out of time, so I'm going to actually close the panel by taking everything that you've said and asking you a question on collective action. Will, I think you touched upon not putting too much responsibility on the shoulders of industry, and that makes complete sense. We're working on multiple facets, multiple frameworks. We need to be working with all stakeholders. So I would like to ask all of you, 30 seconds, in this context of industry and corporate stewardship for water, what is the role of the public sector to facilitate this? Will, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I talk about wicked problems. So I'll start with that and say that every stakeholder group has capabilities, scale, and skills that can be leveraged. And the private sector is, I think, very unique in that it has scale and it can be nimble. So the private sector has the ability to potentially influence public policy, in particular around water, but also has the ability to engage with entrepreneurs and investors to come up with innovative solutions. So for me, the private sector is really unique, incredibly powerful, but let's not put a burden on the private sector to do things that the public sector should be doing or other stakeholder groups.
Kate.
5 years ago, the Central Bank of France mandated finance in companies to disclose their climate-related risks and their GHG emissions across their portfolio. 5 years on from their introduction of that report, from that policy, Their evidence suggests that finance institutions that were subject to the law are 40% less likely to fund fossil fuels, thereby demonstrating the power of mandating disclosure. So the single biggest action that that governments and regulators can take right now, and the movement is already underway, and we've just undertaken a landscape assessment of mandatory water reporting around the world, but is to mandate comprehensive water reporting, not only for large water users such as Meta, but for financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, and Vanguard. The moment we use this policy implementation method, the quicker the action and outcomes that we will achieve.
Great. Tom, I'm going to come to you, and then Amanda, it'd be great to hear what you need to move forward from the public sector. But Tom, first you.
Great. And just to agree with what Kate said, and we hear progressive companies wanting disclosure to be mandated as well. Look, I think a really positive thing we've seen over the last decade or so in water and other areas like climate is multi-stakeholderism. And part of the reason why this is flourishing is because we've recognized the limitations of governments as it relates to financing and technical resources, for example. So I think the role of governments is to convene and empower other stakeholders to take action. And within that setting, business can really ramp up its investments and actions around water stewardship, along with all the other multiple stakeholders that have skin in the game as it relates to water resources.
Amanda, last word with you.
And look, I'm only going to agree with my fellow panelists. Governments certainly have a role in convening the private sector with other stakeholders to talk about these issues. And they certainly have a role in supporting more effective business engagement in this case, water protection and water conservation. I think through legislation, through incentive mechanisms, they can encourage companies to be more resource efficient and more transparent in their water use. And we're seeing that this year with the Securities and Exchange Commission's move to mandate climate-related disclosures in corporate financial reporting. I think if that is approved, it will eventually have a huge impact on how companies manage and report their environmental impacts overall, including their water impacts.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your thoughts and case studies, which is always important. And we hope to have more episodes and editions like this to dig deeper into what industry can do to actually take a leadership position when it comes to corporate water stewardship. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today for this edition of the Business Accelerator 2022. And we'd like to thank our partners again, the Government of the Netherlands and Meta, for helping us have this discussion on corporate water stewardship. Thank you.